Welcome to everyone who is just joining our session. Similar to our previous sessions, we'll give it just a minute or two to allow others to join. And in the meantime, you may see a poll on your screen. Please feel free to answer or submit a question or answer if you'd like to. And the results will come up in just a minute as well. And for everyone just joining, we're just giving it just a minute or two until it looks like the bulk of the group is in here and is joined. As we allow everyone to join, you'll see a quick poll on your screen. Please feel free to submit an answer if you would like to, and we'll get kicked off in just a minute. It looks like we have a pretty good group that has joined, so we can get started. Thank you again for joining us for today's ethical marketing session. My name is Sarah Van Pelt, and I am your Wire Wheel host for this session. Before I introduce the moderator for this session, I'll cover just a few housekeeping items. Please note that the views expressed here today by the speakers are their own and not the views of their organizations. And secondly, we hope this session will be interactive. So please submit questions via the question and answer feature in Zoom at any time during the session, but please do not submit questions through the chat box. As we get our session kicked off, you should see the poll results on your screen, and I'd like to welcome you once again to our session. I'm excited to introduce you to our moderator for today's session, Camille Landau, Chief Marketing Officer at WireWheel. So Camille, I'll pass it over to you to introduce our panelists and begin the ethical marketing panel. And I'll be back at the end of the session to wrap things up.
Terrific. Well, hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. And thanks for joining this terrific group of thought leaders in our space who I know to be very engaged on topics related to consumer trust, marketing, and ethical marketing, which we'll get into a little bit more deeply. I just want to briefly introduce who's here and then ask people to share a little bit about their background and how it intersects with our topics. We have Elisa Bergman, who is Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer at Adobe. And Tanisha Gordon, who's a senior manager at Deloitte, where she helps corporations and government organizations strategize around issues they face in the digital world we live in, including around risk analysis, data governance, and privacy. And Vivek Narandias, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, but Vivek is the Associate General Counsel for Privacy and IP and the Data Protection Officer at Shopify. And Jules Polonetsky is the CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum. I'm the CMO of WireWheel, where, of course, my role includes assuring ethical privacy here. But let me start by asking each of you, maybe starting with Elisa and then Tanisha, and then I'll ask the others, to share more about your background and how it brings you to topics the panel is discussing today.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here with this STEAM panel and talk about this subject that's very near and dear to my heart. So a little bit about my background. I lived in Washington, D.C. and Brussels for many years and focused on a lot of issues around data and marketing, and was actively involved with leading trade associations in the space, writing the self-regulatory rules around marketing and advertising and what the policy should be in the various sectoral approaches to privacy in the United States. Similarly, I did a lot of work in that regard in Europe. And then after being at leading privacy practices at law firms, I went in-house to an entertainment company, and then that brought me here to Adobe. So I'm interested in the topic because I think privacy and trust are two sides of the very same coin. And I'm all about thinking about how we can take what potentially are kind of compliance issues or risk issues that we face with privacy laws and figure out how that's opportunities to delight consumers with experiences that are grounded in trust.
Beautiful. Tanisha.
Hi, Tanisha Gordon. I'm based out of our San Francisco office with Deloitte. My specialty is really around everything data risk. So data strategy, data governance, data privacy, data protection, and I lead that portfolio of work for much of our technology, media, and telco clients on the West Coast. I've also, similar to Lisa, I've spent some time in Europe right ahead of GDPR being implemented, coming into effect. Spent about 3 years there. So primarily work with global organizations. And in terms of the topic today, I've spent a lot of time, I'd say the last 2 years, coming up with approaches, strategy, and thinking about the technical ramification associated with the signal loss. Signal loss from cookies, third-party cookies being deprecated by browsers such as Google, Safari, Firefox, and what that means to the advertisement ecosystem. And I lead our go-to-market relationship with a couple marketing platform, providing the two big ones in the market right now, and been spending a lot of time educating brands on the impact to the cost per acquisition of a customer, their customer acquisition costs, and also helping them to understand how do you adequately balance privacy compliance and move towards this next level of trust or ethical marketing is how we're terming it today, in order to build new touch points with customers, but also more trust in their brands. So that's how my background intersect with what we're talking about today.
Pretty deeply. Vivek.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Camille. My name is Vivek. I'm based in San Diego, actually, but I work at Shopify, which is a Canadian-based e-commerce platform that helps mom and pop shops all around the world build and manage their online sales. So this subject is really important to me in my capacity as managing privacy at Shopify, because the hardest issue for most small businesses is finding and reaching new customers or kind of re-engaging their existing customer base. Just making sales is hard, and doing so in an privacy compliant, but also an ethical way that maintains their trust with their user base is really, really important. And many of these mom and pop shops, they don't have their own dedicated privacy lawyer. So it's an important part of our business to help them along the way. My background was in ad tech. So before this, I was the DPO at a company called Rubicon Project, which kind of is one of the many companies in the third-party ad tech stack. So I have kind of history in this space, both from the ad tech side and now from the kind of more neutral e-commerce platform perspective. But I started my career as a litigator, where I really focused on kind of privacy gone bad on the class action side. So I think I've seen a lot of this from many different perspectives.
Well, we'll circle back to privacy gone bad a little later. And Jules.
Hi, thanks for having me. I've spent now about a decade as the CEO at FPF, where we work with many of the world's leading chief privacy officers on the challenges that they face in this complicated and ever more complex world. I spent about another 10 years as a chief privacy officer at AOL and at DoubleClick, so also kind of learned the world through ad tech challenges in my early days. And then I spent also about 10 years in government as an elected official, as a consumer regulator. I really started thinking about ethics a bit harder when the Obama administration, given that many of the Obama team are back or are playing roles in the upcoming administration, when the Obama team worked on drafting a consumer privacy bill of rights. And in that proposal, opt-in, opt-out, opt-in came into place when you couldn't minimize risk and when there was some likelihood of harm. The deal was opt-in. And I remember sitting down with the team and saying, but what if what you want to do is really, really, really good, like save the planet or just do something that everybody would agree is good, and you can't get a special legislative exception? CCPA now would make it, CPRA would make it illegal for you to ever get a legislative exception if somebody argued it diminished privacy, no matter how good it was, right? One of the bones I'd like to pick with that. And so what the Obama team did, which I thought was interesting and helpful, is they said, oh, well, what do you think? Maybe an ethical review might be useful so that we can vet this the way academics who want to do research have to go through a process. And they put that concept in there, and everybody hated it because the thought was it would be like a safe harbor. The FTC would have to approve it. It wouldn't work. Businesses have to be quick and fast. and advocates didn't like it because it meant, you know, a rubber stamp that would get you out of consent. So it didn't go anywhere. But the basic concept that in law, there ought to be a reflection that there are times when ethics actually say this is the right thing to do, but then who says that, right? You can go pass legislation, but who says that in once you've got a law in place and there aren't a lot of changes? So we are currently deeply focused on trying to build into law, mostly when it comes to data sharing for research, which might be academic research, but companies do a lot of important research today, right? Look at the COVID vaccines. And it's not such a clear line. If you do machine learning research, you might be doing it on the company side. It might be an academic who's working for you. So we're working to figure out what would an ethical review process look like that perhaps could be reflected in law, or might just work for companies who had reason to put their marketing or their AI work or maybe other sensitive areas where it might be legally appropriate, but you might want a process that shows you've took into account maybe a very broad range of harms that might not be recognized in law, but that you might want to think about given your brand, your posture, your view on the ethics of the situation. So I'll stop there.
Well, Jules, actually provided a beautiful segue to my first question, which is you are already helping to lead thought on a framework for ethical review, ethical marketing, but I would say that most brands aren't there. I'm going to turn to you, Tanisha. You probably help brands start to think about or articulate. It's not that they're not thinking about it, but what is ethical marketing? And then possibly posit that against, although they're not necessarily opposed, legally compliant marketing. So how do you and how does this group think about ethical marketing and legally compliant marketing, and any distinctions that you think brands miss?
Thank you for that question. No, absolutely. And I think as privacy and compliance become more and more of the baseline expectation and table stakes, you're going to see, or we're going to see, a lot of movement towards ethical marketing, because you can have compliant marketing, but is it ethical, right? And when thinking about what ethical marketing is, I think it's important for us to see it as a conduit to building customer trust, which is why there may be a propensity to move towards this direction. And the way that I see ethical marketing is three prongs. So one component is around transparency, which is a clear component. Even when we're talking about ethical AI or any other ethical framework, you will always see transparency up and in front of a ethical framework. But what does that mean from an ethical marketing perspective? It's really about not just being clear and concise, let's say, with your consent or cookie notice, but it's being upfront with what you're doing with data versus having to rummage through what the text or the language is around that consent, that opt-in or opt-out statement. The second component is really around respect. So this is respect in terms of respecting your consumer privacy rights. It's also respect from the point of view of fairness, like, are we being fair with how you are marketing to them, or over marketing, or doing market segmentation? Are you leaving them out, or is there room to create bias in terms of what you're marketing to your consumers or not? And it's also about like not crossing what my European colleagues always say, the creepy line. There's always this creepy factor when you think about ethical frameworks in Europe. There's always this conversation around what's creepy and what's not. So like making sure that that is also part of your framework, all under the banner of respect. The third prong or pillar I would call more around acting in the interest of the consumer. So that's around like the way that I'm marketing to this consumer, or the way that I'm tracking their data and I understand their buying pattern and who's following them on social media. Is there a way for me to ensure my consumer safety in store, or safety? Let's say you're able to discern or predict that the buying pattern of this person, you notice that a follower is buying them the same buying pattern or showing up in the same location. Is there an obligation for a brand to communicate that to their consumer if they think that their safety is at risk, or they have a stalker, a digital stalker, right? There are all of these different ethical dilemma based scenarios that may come up, but it's all about acting in the interest of the consumer. It's also about like giving consumers control of their data. That's acting in the interest of the consumer. It is giving consumers incentives and nurturing your customer journey flow. Again, that's all acting in the interest of the consumer. And some brands, you'll notice that when they're making decisions, they'll either already have their, target customer profile, but there's this concept of putting the customer at the seat of the table when making any decisioning or any marketing strategy. So when I'm thinking about ethical marketing, I'm really thinking about those three-pronged approach in terms of transparency, respect, and consumer interest. And again, to the earlier point that was made, that being, the other side of the privacy coin, because if you really achieve these three things, you can enable privacy compliance, where you can be compliant, but you may not be ethical, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. I'm going to remember the 3 prongs because I love threes. But Jules, you've put up into the chat, and I haven't clicked it, but you put up into the chat, and I want other people to know that you have a link there. And could you add to Tanisha's 3 prongs, or is there a 4th prong, or is there a different shape that you use?
Yeah, I think I would just want to flag, and for a long time, I think a lot of us talked about creepy, and obviously we still do. I wrote a law review paper on, a theory of creepy. and so I think creepy is, a helpful way to sort of informally like tell your colleagues, like, you think that's kind of cool, but like real people who, aren't geeked out about it are going to think it's creepy. But I guess the question is, how do you create a more rigorous, right? Because they don't think it's great today. They're like, what do you mean it's creepy? Like we're selling a drone that's going to fly around your house and be an adjunct to your security system, right? And I'm like, that's creepy. They're like, we're the $1 trillion company. We think people are going to buy it, and we have studies. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't go ahead and do our product, right? So how do you kind of build on creepy and have a more formulaic structure? And consider that GDPR wants you to consider the effects on rights and freedoms of the individual, right? Not just the privacy of the individual. And all of the US focus on algorithmic discrimination seems to go beyond simply there's legal activity and now big data is making you do that and you might not know about it. No, people seem to be more worried that you'll learn something about them from their wearable or their smart home device or their loyalty card, and it might be aggregated, and it's maybe not creepy because no one's even gonna know about it. But is there some set of harms that might be hard to capture in law because they're fuzzy and they're not always happening? Filter bubbles, right? Do we want a law against filter bubbles? Filter bubbles are what make sure I get, like, when I search for Apple on a search engine, that I don't get things about apples. I get things about, computers and iPhones. I'm in a filter bubble, but that's like filtering to give me, in my little tech world, the research I need. I don't need the news about apples, right? And so do you want to fix that? But no, in some cases, maybe somebody might care about a filter bubble, right? It might be, used in some harmful way. So in many ways, I think what's helpful and what SIPL did, and companies have built this into their risk assessment, and what FPF did is we said, well, what are all the harms anyone thinks like could be a harm? Let's not fight about whether it ought to be in the law or not. Feelings of apprehension, whatever it is, can we recognize that those things could be laid out, and that when you do a product or when you make a marketing decision, it might be valuable to go through and say, this isn't illegal. I'll give you one quick last example. An academic who we've worked with for years at Georgia Tech walked me through a very natural optimization that happens with algorithms when you determine where to do deliveries. So anybody who lives in a city that's got low-income neighborhoods knows that there are often empty shelves in the lower income small store that doesn't have high turnover. And the wealthy area with high turnover, it's fully stocked. Why does that happen? Is that just sort of discrimination, or is it? And it turns out that the algorithms that want to make sure sales are not lost are going to, on their own, optimize to restock the shelves at the places where if there's empty for an hour, you lose 10 sales. It forces the reality that a low turnover place, typically in a small, lower income neighborhood, is going to have empty shelves. Now, is anyone being racist there? Who wants to do that? Is anyone being like anti-poor people? No. Is it ethical for you to balance and say, I'm going to lose some money and be less efficient because I care about this issue of equal access to my product? Now, companies may come out differently, but you're not even going to have that conversation because no one's doing anything illegal there, but it might not be ethical. Or maybe you're a small shop and you start by delivering where you can make money to deliver and you have hopes of treating everybody fairly. And until then you make a donation or something, right? But let's have that conversation. And that's what I think, having an ethical framework that needs to be more than your gut, because your gut is not consistent. Your gut doesn't have standards across thing. Your gut doesn't have legal impact. So having that risk assessment where you show what you care about, and maybe different companies care about different things, but maybe you show what you care about, and that helps guide people when it comes to these decisions.
Wow, what an interesting example. Vivek, I
Just
saw
wanted
you.
to, yep. I was just sorry, Camille. I just wanted to respond to that. No, I think when we're talking about marketing, just pure marketing versus AI or algorithmic ethical frameworks, like there are tons of leading practices. Even my firm, we have a AI ethical framework. We have entire processes where we go through the PDLC or the SDLC to incorporate, do threat modeling on AI protection, scenario testing. Like there's a whole methodology around that will provide some of that rigor so that you're not focused on just that gut feeling. I think what my experience has been in terms of implementing and applying rigor to ethical reviews and assessments, you're spot on, Jules, in terms of the risk assessment, but it's also building out what is your ethical risk registry consist of, and like how do you codify all the harms that's associated with the way that a company operates. And what I've seen to be effective is to actually insert yourself within the product development lifecycle. So I've done this for ethics by design, privacy by design, security by design for SDLC processes and product development processes, where at certain stages of that process, you would do threat modeling, and we would do ethical threat modeling, and we do scenario-based testing. But there's a way to provide rigor to this by coming up with use cases, threat scenarios, and embedding it in the PDLC and running organizations through those processes before products are released or before campaigns are released and before AI or algorithms are released. So I just want to provide that perspective in terms of what I'm seeing as some leading practices that I personally worked on in the market.
I would agree, leading practice, and really terrific to have frameworks as you're articulating them, Tanisha and Jules, as you're sort of raising the need for. To Vivek and to Elisa, and I'll just go to Vivek first. You're on the practitioner level. You're in the privacy office, and you touch. You work with colleagues in marketing and sales, in IT, etc. If you're like most companies, I'm not saying you're like most companies are not starting where Tanisha just brought us. Most companies are not starting, and probably, especially in your world, Vivek, in the Shopify world of individual mom and pop stores, etc., they're possibly starting from the perspective of, privacy compliance, how do I do that? Will I get in trouble? Versus this holistic brand and consumer-centered view. So I just want to take a moment to get your perspective on the frameworks, or whether they're needed, applicable, how your world intersects there, Vivek, and then Elisa.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important question. I think the frameworks are really helpful. But to me, the most important thing when it comes to thinking about these issues from an ethical perspective, and going beyond maybe the legal requirements of privacy law, is really thinking about kind of decision making as an ecosystem. I think it's really easy for privacy lawyers to think about, check the box. Is this transfer to this particular ad tech vendor covered by, a DPA? Is the DPA okay? Check, we're done. But I think that what that misses is kind of thinking through, 4 hops down, where is this data going? And that particular kind of thinking about the longer term effects, some of the issues that Jules and Tanisha raised around fairness and bias, Small businesses in particular, even if they understand your technology, our technology as a platform, they may not be in a position where they can really even think through what those third and fourth hops are. So from our perspective, ethics in our role as a platform is really important because it means that we have a duty, in our view, to be opinionated as software. We can't just kind of provide pipes. We have to provide pipes with some guidance as to how to use the pipes. And we have to provide documents to explain how to use software in a privacy-friendly way. We have to use, smart defaults that guide people to the right decisions, because without those defaults, they may not know what is the right or privacy-sensitive decision or ethical decision. Again, they may understand it with respect to one hop, but thinking through that 4 hops down, they just may not have the expertise or the skill set or access to knowledge, frankly, to be able to think things through from that perspective. And so I think that's where, our platform, and I know Adobe as well, we really have an opportunity and I think an obligation to help on the ethical side, even if it's going beyond the scope of what the law may require. At the same time, as I mentioned at the outset, finding those customers is such a difficult part of starting an online store. And so it is important for us to also pave a wide lane for what may be ethical. There may be some types of businesses that really need to market in certain types of marketing platforms, use certain channels that other businesses may not feel is appropriate for their line of business. So it's important for us to kind of clear paths for all types of lawful and good businesses, but at the same time provide them guidance as to how to think through, is this really the right decision for your business in a way that makes sense to people that aren't ingrained in privacy law for decades, like some.
That's so interesting. Elisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but as you think about frameworks and their applicability at Adobe, are you thinking from the perspective of your direct users, possibly more so than in Vivek's case, which is he's providing services to users of their platform? And I'm curious how you think about, and again, from a legal perspective, and you're not a product owner, but thinking about privacy by design through your office.
Yeah, sure. So we actually have both parts of our business. We have a very big direct-to-consumer business, but we also have a strong enterprise business where we help build privacy by design into the products and services that a lot of the world's leading brands use by using our platform. But just to put a finer point on some of the great comments from my fellow panelists, technology outpaces the law. So to Tanisha's point, oftentimes you get the question, not what can you do? Technologically, you can probably do anything. From a privacy perspective and legally, a lot of things you can do as long as you get permission, or maybe, at some point in the United States, people used to say, as long as you just put up a skull and crossbones or whatever, as far as a privacy policy, and you sort of bury it in there, you could actually do it. So some of the ethical questions and really the trust questions, the brand questions really become not just what can you do legally and technologically, but what should you do? And that being really a function of brand and long-term value. So that becomes really important. I think there were some good comments on how to operationalize that in a company. That's really, really hard, because you're right, some of it is just a gut. A company like ours and many leading brands, we really stick close to our values, and our values are important to us, and doing right by our consumers, and we're 100% consumer focused. That's really important to us. So we take that very seriously, that responsibility. So a lot of the calls are easy because we are consumers ourselves, and our consumers are a top priority for us, as are our enterprise customers. And we want to be the extension of the trust that consumers put into those brands. So we take that responsibility very seriously. We do those kinds of things that Tanisha talked about: privacy impact assessments, ethical impact assessments. It's pretty hard to standardize them if you're scaling them across a big company. And I know a lot of privacy officers in the space spend a lot of time doing that. And one of the things that we've been working on a lot, which is our vision for our enterprise customers in the digital marketing space, which is people don't buy products or services. What they really want is experiences. So we aligned our privacy vision to that at Adobe, which is experiential privacy. So that's really make privacy a positive part of the experience. So what I talked about previously, rather than thinking about privacy as really just a compliance issue, I think marketers and everyone are saying, wow, this is our first touch point with our users in Europe with cookie consent. So rather than it having be a bad experience where you're trying to get it out of the way, how do you think about, like Tanisha said, the customer journey and make it delightful and really have privacy unlock great value for them and let them understand the value exchange of giving data to get a better personalized experience that's not creepy. So hopefully that's responsive to your question.
Oh, it is. It is.
I just want to say I love Adobe. You just made me so happy.
Oh.
I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Like you really get how to make it a brand differentiator. Like that's amazing.
I agree. And Adobe is a brand that probably most of us on this call have interacted with, probably from the beginning. And so as a side note, Elisa, do you feel like there is enough sophistication at Adobe about brand and around trust that you can say, you can bring up statements such as, well, because privacy is obviously important to our brand, we should do X or Y?
Yeah, I think people agree that good privacy is good business, as they say, you know, so I think people realize that again, doing right by privacy and being transparent and thinking about protecting the data throughout the data lifecycle. I know some of the things Vivek talked about too, you know, again, just because you can do it, should you do it? So I think there's a lot of focus on that and doing right by our consumers. And for our enterprise customers, I know Vivek talked about that as well too, because we have this opportunity to provide products and services to our customers. How do we be that extension of the trust story by giving them the tools for data lifecycle management, helping them track their permissions and all the kind of things that they want to do so they can get it right when they're bringing data onto a platform and they want to do digital transformations in a privacy preserving way? Can we give them the tools to be able to do that, to unlock their trust stories meaningfully? So yeah, I think it's a core part of what we're doing.
So we have Lisa at a brand that we've all appreciated over time, a mature, but not to say old brand. And we have Vivek at in the center of an ecosystem of many new brands, many new companies. You know, it's a great starting point for startups. Wonderful, heartwarming stories of companies started by one person through your platform. So what would you say a company using your platform, what are some of the more difficult or day-to-day decisions that they have to make? Potential frictions between privacy as a brand value and we've just got to get a sale.
So it's a great question, and it's one that we really struggle with. I think, you know, there was a great New York Times article about, you know, the experience of starting an online business over the Black Friday weekend. And her conclusion was there's lots of tools to help, and Shopify is one of them, to help you start an online business. But at the end of the day, it's still really hard to find a customer and to find your first customer. And so I think the hardest issue is just if you are a mom and pop, you're looking to start an online store, you start an online store that can sell anywhere in the world, you immediately have to start thinking about CPRA, you have to start thinking about GDPR, you have to start thinking about CPPA in Canada. You are in a global ecosystem that is probably just too complex for you to understand. And so, you know, I think there's a role for all of us that are practitioners on the platform side to play in helping you scale so that you don't have to be thinking about the distinctions between CPRA and CCPA. You know, that is not going to happen in a way that actually enables every one of those businesses to fully be compliant if the burden is on them. But at the same time, I think one of the difficult pieces is, you know, they don't know necessarily what they don't know. If they're not technical experts, how are they supposed to really understand the ins and outs of the third-party ad tech ecosystem that they feel like they need to plug into? So a lot of it is guidance. It's helping them understand what is happening when you start a marketing campaign on a large platform. Where does the data go? And then a lot of it is guiding them to make the right decision or helping them kind of set them up with defaults where they don't have to necessarily think about these issues longer term. And then making sure that their expectations are met. If they say, my consumer has asked me to delete their information, I'm going to click this button, it should do what they would expect that button to do. It shouldn't be something that is maybe legally defensible, but doesn't go to the extent that they would expect it to go. So part of it is understanding their needs and setting the right expectations with them, and then helping them understand just what is happening out there in the internet in a way that they may not appreciate without.
So I appreciate, Vivek, that to be a small business owner and to face, oh gosh, wait, there are regulations, and not only in the US, but also in Europe, because by nature of the internet, I'm global, et cetera, that can seem overwhelming. On the flip side, I'm curious as to whether anybody here has seen the frameworks of law provide helpful operating system, provide a common language, because to what extent are the laws not only a, yes, complex and a challenge, but on the other hand, useful in being able to advance the higher value of privacy, which is something that each of us here cares about. Anyone? Maybe Elisa?
Yeah, I'll take that, and I'm sure Jules will have good thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
he's thinking right now.
After, Jules, because I imagine you have great thoughts on this. One thing I'll say is, I would say a law like GDPR really put privacy on the map in a way that has never been on the map before. Although I know, like Jules, we feel like we've been in the space for a long time. So welcome everybody else who's more recently come to privacy. But the fact of the 4%, up to 4% fines really got board level attention, and just attention that it has never gotten before. So I think the short answer to your question is yes. I think laws have helped that, because it's just given a bit of that kind of board level focus and more senior management focus on a topic. And then privacy is really becoming integral to data, really. And data is such an important asset that companies have, and the ability to use data in a meaningful and privacy responsible way with your consumers is important too. So as it becomes a big asset, the privacy requirements around it, the movement of laws, I think all of that has contributed to make it what I often call a moment where it's really privacy's time. Jules, may throw to you, because I'm sure you'll have some additional good thoughts.
So look, I think most sophisticated companies or people working for a long time, would have told you, sure, it's a core information practice, a fair practice to provide access, to have deletion rights, but not everybody was doing it, and not everybody was doing it well. And so, yes, right, CCPA and other laws sort of come in, and bluntly, sometimes without the kind of nuance and the exceptions and the flexibility, and shouldn't really cover maybe personal data and not other data where you can't authenticate, but it kicked kind of some butts, and it said you have to do this. It's already law in a lot of places in the world, and if you're looking to do business with data, no matter how big or small you are, just like your website has to respond when people click, if they give you data, you have to be able to let them delete it in some cases, and have framings around how long you're going to keep it. So that was important. That was healthy. I think in all of the more nuanced and sophisticated areas, the US is not being even as sophisticated as the GDPR, which has its challenges and sometimes has regulators interpreting it to the nth degree that maybe removes some of the flexibility, but having different stages for data that's pseudonymous, right? Which GDPR maybe didn't go as far as some wanted, but gives it, as opposed to some of the US laws that are just saying everything in or out, right? So CCPA is a good example of a very blunt law, right? You can sell anything, whatever you want, just have a link, as opposed to where's sort of the nuance. Privacy impact assessments, probably a real helpful thing. A lot of businesses, I think, thought it was too much bureaucracy, but I think everybody now appreciates that if you don't have some sort of, impact assessment that is structured, and if you actually don't have any good idea of where all your data is, right, which again, people didn't have to do to kind of be okay with compliance. And this helped, I think, a lot of the legal and privacy folks say, I now need those resources because someone actually needs to know where all of our data is, not just, don't worry, the marketing department has it, and so on and so forth. So CCPA and CPRA, unfortunately, don't incent that. The Washington Privacy Act tried to introduce that and got a lot of pushback, both from advocates who said, hey, doesn't really mean anything unless we get to see it and the AG gets it and it's sort of, you know, used against you, as opposed to that internal hygiene, right? One of the positive things about the some of the Commerce Committee proposals is they say you've got to have somebody in charge, designated, who, you know, is actually at security or at privacy. So, you know, it's not the sexy part to say spend money on people and accountability and structure and process, but you know what? That's almost 90% of it, right? 10% is, okay, what are the hard decisions? The biggest work is your business spending the money or doing the work to actually be ready to handle data? And even if you're a small business, if you have, you know, millions of customers and, you know, sensitive data, your credit card company doesn't say to you, hey, you can, you know, you can process, you know, credit cards. You're a small business, so, you know, we'll let you not have any security, right? Like everyone's got to live to that set of standards. So I'm glad we're seeing legislation. When we have a national bill, perhaps in the upcoming year or two, it'll set a norm that I think will help a lot of companies, you know, move forward. But I don't think we've yet done a good job at dealing with the more nuanced issues. What is sensitive in a world where everything can be sensitive, right? Do we just say certain things, or do we leave flexibility where we trust companies, and not just companies, schools, universities, you know, researchers? Where do we give companies the ability to maybe make thoughtful decisions and incent that in some way?
Can I just add to that?
Yes, Vivek.
So, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think from our perspective, again, dealing with smaller businesses that may not have access to privacy resourcing, the GDPR was really helpful in that it gave us a language with which we could use as a reference point to communicate with those small businesses. These are the scope of requirements that you should be looking at, even if you're not in Europe. It gave us a consistent set of terms, a consistent set of issues, approaches to communicate. We had a white paper. It was useful. But when we start moving from that to a world where we have to say personal data means this, and when you click delete in Europe, you're accomplishing this, but it may not accomplish what you need under CPRA. I mean, we have now multiple white papers, and it just gets to a place where a small business is again in a world where they don't have a set of guideposts that they can practically use unless they have a dedicated privacy officer or external privacy counsel. And that's just not realistic for many of these smaller businesses. And so, you know, to the extent that we have more and more frameworks coming up that use kind of, for no apparent reason, different standards, different definitions, slight deviations in requirements, again, accomplishing, I'm not sure what, I think it detracts from this goal of helping businesses kind of achieve a level of trust that I think all policymakers and all of us on this panel and in this room want to achieve.
I think we are echoing the notion of the distinction between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and how sometimes the letter of the law, for example, for small businesses, can be such a thicket that we don't even take the room for the spirit. Further complication if the letter of law and the laws get more complicated and more numerous. So in terms of the spirit of the law, one other theme I've been hearing here in this panel is the importance of this, not only the uses of data to be collaboratively shared, the protection of data to be collaborative, but probably other functions of the organization too, how important it is to build trust collaboratively. And Tanisha, putting you on the spot, let's say I'm a large company, a Deloitte client, and I'm senior enough to know that we could be doing more to build trust, ensure trust, make trust a stronger pillar of our brand. Where are some weaknesses that you've seen in organizations? Where would you start, or what are the questions you would start asking, or who are the people you would put into a room for further collaboration?
No, that's a really good one. I think, you know, first it's typically when words of trust, when the concept of a trust keeps coming up, is typically when there's a very aware CMO or, you know, like where they're thinking about, okay, how can I use trust as a lever to advance our brand? So for example, I had a CMO, it's a very sophisticated brand, and he read a recent research report that ranked all industries from the least trusted to the most trusted, and the least trusted industry ended up being telco. And I was also like, wow, consumers don't really trust telco. Like, that was very interesting to me. And he's a CMO for a telco company. So he's like, is there a way for us to use privacy, just like what Alicia was saying earlier, like it's on the other side of trust? Is there a way for us to use privacy and be more transparent to like fix this brand thing? It's a really industry wide, but can we fix this brand thing so that it doesn't tarnish our brand because of what's happening in the industry? And that was a really thoughtful conversation. And to answer your question, Camille, when we're talking about trust, it can no longer, it seeps across business areas, seeps across executives. So that conversation, we had to bring in the chief strategy officer, the head of privacy, the CDO, and the chief marketing officer were all in one room talking about what does trust mean for us, because everybody's a stakeholder. And of course, security came and said, oh, don't forget, I got to protect this stuff so that we could maintain this trust. So to answer that question, it's usually just from I think this is becoming a thing over the last 18 months. It's a trigger for the CMO, but then he realized that everyone needs to be at the table, because now the chief strategy officer needs to say, okay, what's our strategy from a market perspective to partner with trusted organization, to brand ourselves from a trust perspective? What does that mean about the way that we acquire data? Do we have to sever relationships with data brokers now because they look shady, right? So that's a strategy decision. Then the marketer is like, okay, can I use, Alicia, I think what you said, Elisa, was amazing, how you're using the way that customers engage with your cookie, like making that a much more pleasant experience. This CMO said, with the chief data officer said, is there a way for us to, because they were getting like 100,000 CDR requests a month, data subject rights requests. So they're like, wait, can we build a trust portal? Let's build a trust portal together and use that as a new customer touch point and make that a whole new customer experience and put it on our customer journey map. And it ended up when we helped them build that customer trust portal, it was the most engaged product they've ever released. And they're a product company, like they just release products. So you're totally ahead of the game. You and Adobe are totally ahead of the game there. So in short, I would say the trigger is brand. How does trust actually impact your brand? Because if you have brand trust, you can literally withstand a pandemic. And then bringing everyone at the table to see how trust impacts what their mandate is going to be super critical.
That's how I withstand the pandemic. I think that is very compelling. Well, since we're coming to the end of our scheduled time, and inspired by what Tanisha said, who else can build on what a brand can do looking forward to a landscape that is going to both have more letter of the law, so more regulation, more nuance to that, but also more consumer demand for trust? It's interesting from your survey, the survey you mentioned that whether customers think about it in the terms we use or not, they do know which brands they trust versus the brands they don't. It does register. So what should brands think about to put in place now? And if that's too hard a question, what mistakes should they avoid? And I'm going to start with Vivek, because you had mentioned, you've seen some bad moves. What not to do, and otherwise what to do that you'll be so glad in 3 years you thought about now. So Vivek, you first.
Well, I would say, what not to do is to approach privacy purely as a compliance exercise, where you think about, what is my ad tech vendor? Do we have a contract in place? Check. That's not sufficient, even under law, frankly. But it's certainly not going to set you up in a position where, you will be able to weather whatever comes on the policy end, on the legislative end. Who knows? You won't be in a position where you won't have to reconsider that, 6 months down the line. And so I would say if you are a marketer at a company, you should be thinking about, again, the ecosystem of what is happening with your customers and their data, not just your vendors, but who are they engaged with? How are you buying ad inventory? How are they doing it on your behalf? Are they, combining your data with other people's? Understanding, practically speaking, from the perspective of your customers, how does a deletion request get actioned up and down the chain? Really thinking about it from that macro perspective. And again, not with an eye to compliance necessarily, just, is this data leaving Europe? That's important to think through, but that's not the extent of it. Just really understanding at a, not just at a data map level, but at a conceptual level, what is happening to your customers' data when it leaves your system, and how do they go about rectifying it or vindicating their rights? And at the end of the day, how do you communicate that to your customers in a way that they actually understand? And I would say from my perspective, UX research on privacy disclosures has actually been really interesting and helpful for us. Something that I hadn't really thought of until a few years ago. And I found it has been really useful to see, what do people understand when they read a particular dialog box or disclosure. And so, to the extent that you're trying to communicate something really complex that may confuse or concern some users, thinking about, maybe consulting with someone on the UX side is something that I would consider advocating for.
A great nexus there. Elisa, I think you nodded on the UX notion.
Oh, yeah.
What to do or what not to do, or both.
I'll just pick up on that exact topic. I agree more with what Vivek said, but the notion that I talked about previously about experiential privacy and making privacy a positive part of the experience and really putting your users at the center of it. We've been doing a lot of work around design thinking and that being kind of the front end of experiential privacy. As I mentioned before, customer journey mapping, thinking about how they come to your site. Really, we've done some design jams, which we picked up from our design colleagues and calling them privacy design jams, where to Tanisha's point, we brought all of the stakeholders in the room. So we brought the technical team, the legal team, the design team, the marketing team, and everybody had their different KPIs. And we wanted to be sure that we brought all those together so we could really bring a great experience to life. So I think that's great. And we did a lot of user testing to make sure that it was right. We also made sure that, Europe's not a country, it's a region. So one of the things we didn't talk about here was that people and cultures have very different attitudes towards privacy. So taking all of that into account as you're thinking about those issues.
Inspiring, the jams. Jules, what to do or what not to do?
Yeah, look, I think if you're a prominent company and you don't have a cohesive philosophy, Senator, we care about privacy, or we care about privacy, here's our privacy policy, right? It just doesn't kind of cut it anymore. People are cynical. They kind of get that data is being used, and they aren't necessarily even thinking about it often in terms of privacy. These are features, right? When I want to turn on or off my smart home thing, I may not be thinking privacy. I'm sort of thinking, how does this work? What am I signing up for? Am I going to get email, right? It's this incredible, these are now core features, right? These are the tools that business and engineering and UI design, right, need to own, because these aren't, and there still are plenty of piddly kind of legalistic sort of things that we gotta, sorry, you have to say these words when it comes to sale. That's what the law says. You cannot say it the way you want to say it. You can't design it the way people might understand it. You gotta say what Mr. McTaggart said, needs to be said, right? But in a whole host of other areas, these are engineering functionalities that collaboratively need to be built and structured, right? Number one. Privacy has become too important for the privacy people, right? These are core business needs: access, deletion, people being able to, have some semblance of control when there are complicated UIs and lots of decisions, right? If you screw up your settings on social media, I guess that's a privacy snafu, but that's like a product failure, right? Like you showed the picture that you didn't want to show to the wrong audience, or, you shared, inappropriately. It breaks. And all of us are dealing with products that are in everyone's lives, right? What we see, what we click, what we do, what we listen, it's on our bodies, right? We know a huge amount. And so we need to productize that in a way that reflects what the product is supposed to be doing for people. But then to get back to the ethics framing, if we don't have a notion of where we fit in society, right? You didn't need to pay attention, to the protests, right? To be aware that the country is increasingly more sensitized to, are you a socially good business? Are you there just to make money? How are you treating your employees? COVID, right? So how does privacy fit into that sense of ESG and social responsibility, right? We monitor, right? We don't say we burn our employees to the maximum because that's how we make most money, right? Your board wants you treating your employees well and figuring out who your stakeholders are so that you are a good contributor to society, not just like a big capitalist sort of machine that burns, the oil at every way. And so how we use data and our philosophy of how we are good environmentalists around how we use data is a critical part of that picture.
Agreed. And Tanisha, you get the last word on what to do or what not to do.
Absolutely. My what to do is basically stitching all of our panelists like great idea, and it's probably a little bit provocative, but if you have legal only owning privacy, you're not going to be able to move towards trust, ethical marketing, and privacy of the future. So not to say that there's not a place for legal, but depending on which industry you're in, what sector you're in, and the type of data you are processing and how you engage with your users, maybe your privacy organization needs to be in engineering with an integration point from legal into that. Or maybe your privacy function needs to just be in digital, where you're doing a lot of like UX design with an integration of legal. Or maybe it's in your compliance organization with tentacles into, product, digital, data. Maybe it's in your data organization. Maybe you establish, I know two brands actually that establish privacy as a product and it's its own function, and they coordinate with privacy legal. So I think it's going to be viable in the future with the way that products and new technologies evolving so fast. Think about privacy in a much more agile and fluid way, where it could sit in various components of an organization, still has its tentacles in legal, but it should be able to flourish wherever thought is being put into product building or user experience. It needs to sit in the center of that.
Beautiful. Drop the mic. This was, I am really energized by this session, I would say, not only as a marketer, but in thinking about brands that I interact with and thinking about my senior position here at this business. You've given us frameworks and inspiration. So I want to thank each of the inspiring panelists, and I want to hand it to Sarah, who is going to get us to the next session.
Thank you, Cami, and that concludes our session. So thank you again to all of our speakers and attendees. I'd like to remind everyone that the recordings of this and all of the other sessions will be made available after the conference ends. On your screen, you should see the agenda for the rest of the day, and the next session is the impact of privacy regulations on social media and retargeting, which begins in just a few minutes at 4 p.m. We hope to see you there and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.